You know how at the end of last episode there was a bit of a colossal problem standing in the way of Team RWBY? Well, this episode, things get quite a bit worse. But before we get into that, I will say spoiler warning for those who have not seen episode 8 of Ice Queendom. I will not be showing the episode or any clips from it in this video, simply images of the episode and analyzing the events that take place. I will leave links in the description below so you guys can go to watch the episode on either Rooster Teeth First or Crunchyroll and support this amazing series. Now, the episode itself starts off with a bit of a recap of the things that went wrong at the end of last episode. The tiny Weisses, some of them turning into Titan Weisses and starting to attack Jean and Pyrrha. Ren and Nora as well being corrupted by the Nightmare, starting to attack them. And then Nightmare Weiss herself showing up and declaring that she's going to pass judgment on everyone as she awakens the colossal Big Nicholas and starts attacking everyone. Which continues here. Team RWBY knows that they need to actually make it into the tower and somehow avoid Big Nicholas, and RWBY volunteers for the job. Yang tries to tell her that she'll volunteer instead, but RWBY stands her ground and says now is not the time to treat me like a child, showing some growth from RWBY, that Weiss's words are having an effect on her, and Yang is even more proud of her sister. Plus, it just makes sense given RWBY's semblance, with hers being the speed semblance, she'd be able to dodge out of the way of the attacks, because you'd think with Big Nicholas being as, well, big as he is, there'd be enough time for RWBY to dodge out of the way of the attacks. He'd move a little bit slower. More so than Yang, at least, especially given her semblance. And Yang would probably just try to punch the hand that's coming towards her, which may not end so well. Blake would also be another good choice given her semblance, but RWBY is the most logical choice. And so it's decided that Blake and Yang will play decoy so RWBY can get to the tower, where she'll then create a door to allow all of them to regroup and fight the Nightmare once again. But Big Nicholas's first target is not actually Team RWBY. No, instead he goes after all of the tiny and Titan Weisses. You know what they say, if anything happens to the cute little girl, we riot. But for the moment, it seems he's just been able to capture all of them. Nightmare Weiss, on the other hand, goes to see the statue of Jacques that was under the influence of the tiny Weisses, carrying the childlike mentality, wanting to play with their family, and Weiss turns this Jacques statue into her Armagigas, which also seems to alter the personality of Jacques within the dream, just in general. We see the hologram within Weiss's inner sanctum also covered in armor and having kind of an Oni mask almost, a demon's face. And this has now become Weiss's new guardian of sorts, going after all of the corrupted soldiers that were affected by the tiny Weiss's influence. And, well, they're just getting wiped out by her Armagigas. Jean and Pyrrha, on the other hand, were able to get away, and Jean immediately uses a coin to call Xion, because he doesn't really know what to do. As he calls Xion, he's saying that Weiss's dream is now out of control, and Xion pretty much tells him Weiss's heart is resisting the changes to the dream, and the Nightmare is taking advantage of that. They are past the point of no return, which to me is kind of repeating what they already knew, and I kind of think Jean just wasted this coin. They knew going into the dream that this was probably going to be their last chance, so of course there's no going back. And Xion also warned them that if the changes are too much, Weiss's heart could start rejecting them, which ended up being the case here. So I don't really know what help Jean was trying to get out of this, but Xion pretty much warned them in advance of everything that was going to happen. So after Xion pretty much told Jean to just deal with it, we see what happened to the tiny Weisses. Big Nicholas had rounded all of them up and proceeded to blast them with eye lasers. Well, alright then, time to riot. What was that? Oh, he just returned the Titan Weisses back to their original forms? And then return them all to the Silly's jail, where it's supposed to be safe? Alright. No rioting for now, the tiny Weisses are safe. In other news, Ren and Nora were turned into Titans, and they proceed to try to attack Weiss. But, of course, her Armagigas takes out Ren in one slash, and then Weiss herself takes out Nora personally. Wonder if there's something to be read into there about Weiss's feelings towards Nora. Probably nothing, but still, one-shotted both of them and sent both of them back to the Silly's jail as well. We then see that Blake and Yang are successfully distracting Big Nicholas while RWBY is making her way to the tower. But a new opponent stands in her way, quite possibly the most difficult one to overcome in all of Ice Queendom. Batley. I honestly don't know what Whitley was thinking in this moment, confronting, well, anyone, really, in a confrontation, considering everyone is larger than he is. And we see easily how that ended. His facial expression says everything you need to know. We hear a gunshot from Ruby's weapon, but the next frame we see, Whitley is sent flying, and, well, the barrel of Ruby's weapon is pointed in the opposite direction, so I think Ruby just swatted him away and sent him flying. Like, what did Whitley think he was going to accomplish? Essentially, nothing, because Ruby is able to make it to the tower. She sends off a signal flare to let Blake and Yang know that the plan was successful, and as she gets inside, she's able to create a door. They all regroup and start making their way deeper into Weiss's inner heart. We see some familiar areas that we've passed through before, so it seems like nothing really has changed. We see the giant room that has all of the massive chairs and repeated hallway, as well as the Ouroboros, where Ruby is using the yellow relic to open up the path, the same as she did before. In the meantime, Jean and Pyrrha are sneaking around the back alleys trying to avoid detection, while also watching the Armagigas take out all of the brainwashed soldiers. And it seems that once they're taken out, they can sink into Weiss's glyphs, being taken somewhere else. And Jean is expressing the sentiment that he'll do whatever it takes to wake Weiss up. Well, you'll have your chance as Weiss appears right behind him. And he, of course, is a little bit surprised, runs a couple steps away. Pyrrha runs behind him, and so Jean is protecting her. And then he says, "It's time to wake up, Ice Queen." You know, the show is really trying to set up that Jean cares about Weiss, and we know that he does have a huge crush on her from watching volumes 1 and 2 of the original RWBY series, but he's calling her Ice Queen just a little bit too much. It's not a term of endearment, so, you know, a little bit of a disconnect here. However, immediately after Jean says that he's going to wake her up, he's pointing his sword directly at her, ready for a fight, we see him teleported immediately to the Silly's jail. That really didn't work out for him. But it seems that Weiss now has the capability to use her glyphs to instantly teleport anyone she wants to wherever she wants. And that comes into play later in this episode, but that's a little bit of an overpowered ability. She doesn't even have to defeat an opponent, and then she can just teleport them away. I really hope that doesn't translate into her actual semblance in the RWBY series, because that would just be way, way too broken given everything that glyphs can already do. And the reason I say I hope it doesn't translate is because, well, her glyphs in the RWBY series do have a minor bit of teleportation with them already. We see her create glyphs in the RWBY series and then shoot dust out of them. How does the dust get from her Myrtanaster to the glyphs? It has to teleport, so that is something that her glyphs can just inherently do. Her semblance has a ton of different abilities. It is the one semblance that, above all others, breaks the rules of semblances. So, you know, especially in Weiss's dream, it takes that to the highest level. But now, upon returning to the Silly's jail, Jean, of course, wants to get back out there, get back into the fight, and so he starts banging on the door, which is Dopey Klein. However, he receives no response as the door begins to freeze over. The nightmare has now entered the safe sanctum that was the Silly's jail. As Jean runs further in, he sees that the tree, the confusing signs where the relic was hidden, is covered in the nightmare's thorns, and he realizes that by removing the relic, he removed the safety of the Silly's jail, and now all of them are in danger. He quickly uses one of the coins to create a door and escape, but by doing so, he not only leaves Ren and Nora behind, but also a number of the tiny Weisses. Is it time to riot now? A number of the tiny Weisses, including, as Jean runs through the door with Pyrrha and a number of the Weisses following him, we see one of the Weisses grabbed by the thorns. If she's not okay at the end of this series, we're going to have some issues. Nothing can happen to the cute small child, but, you know, we'll wait and see, but we'll keep rioting in the back pocket. The door that Jean, Pyrrha, and the Weisses escape from is the one that Team RWBY created right near the train tracks. So all of them make a beeline for the train, probably hoping to find some sanctuary there, or at least a way to escape from the nightmare temporarily. And as they make it to the train, they realize the nightmare can't actually make it inside. And Jean is wondering why, and Pyrrha looks up at the sword that is still impaled in the train. The sword is creating an extra sanctuary against the nightmare. Essentially, the sword itself is acting almost like the relics do within the dream. I again ask, Why does Jean have this sword? It's later mentioned in the episode that the sword is a representation of his immunity to the nightmare. I don't really buy that, given that Jean is supposed to be invisible to the nightmare. He's not supposed to be able to enter the dream and immediately have a weapon against it. That wasn't something that was mentioned before, so it still seems like a little bit of a disconnect, and I hope that this sword is explained later on. We then catch up with Team RWBY as they've made it to the garden area of Weiss's heart, and we see a little bit of an expanded view of it, that it is only one level of multiple different skyscrapers of gardens, and that shows how complex Weiss's heart is. They are merely in one portion of it that will lead to the center. As they are there, though, Jean tries calling them, but it seems the nightmare is able to interfere with their communications. Ruby's scroll is fuzzy, and she can't really make out what Jean is saying, and then the nightmare's thorns burst out of it. Ruby drops it, and as it hits the ground, it turns to ice. And I have a few questions about this scene. The relics are supposed to act as kind of a safety against the nightmare, correct? Because Ruby was holding the relic in her hand and had the scroll directly in contact with the relic, and yet the nightmare was able to pass through the scroll, corrupt the scroll, and essentially make it useless. Shouldn't the relic have had some effect on it, considering Ruby was still holding it? I understand that if she dropped the relic and it was no longer in the control of someone who has their own thought and who wants to save Weiss and can kind of resonate with the relic to use its power, I can understand if it's just on the ground, the nightmare being able to break it and shatter it, but Ruby was still holding the thing. I don't understand why the nightmare was able to affect the scroll while Ruby had it in her hand. Unless, of course, they're going to go the route that the relic can only be used by the respective team member. So Ruby can only use the red one, this yellow one was supposed to be used by Yang, and then Blake will eventually use the black or purple one when that one eventually turns up. Which would also potentially mean that Jean's the only one who can use that sword, the one that he can't actually pick up, so again, we're going to have to see how things unfold in later episodes, because some things really aren't making sense right now. As Ruby drops the scroll, though, we do see the nightmare thorns appear on her hand. That scratch that she got from the nightmare infected her with a nightmare as well. Something that I feel Shion probably should have known about, given that Shion probably saw Ruby's hand being bandaged up when they escaped from the nightmare the second time, or escaped from the dream the second time. Shion probably should have asked, or would have logically asked, how Ruby got that wound, or given that Shion is a nightmare hunter, they should know that if someone suffers a physical wound from jumping into a dream, that could only be caused by the nightmare, and so, I think Shion logically should have known that Ruby was infected by a nightmare, and maybe it's not the best idea to send her in. Regardless, we see that Ruby is affected by the nightmare, but she doesn't know it yet. And so, the three of them delve further into Weiss's dream. They make it to the cathedral area and then into the concert hall where the nightmare still resides, cradling the volumes 4 to 5 dress of Weiss, except it's not looking as pristine as it did previously. It now seems tattered and worn, and it is kind of showing the wear that this has taken on Weiss's heart, the toll of delving into the nightmare a couple different times, changing the dream, and how Weiss is fighting against it. At least that's how I interpret it. And once again, they try to fight the nightmare. Somewhat more successful this time, but also not near as much, considering that Weiss shows up immediately, creates a glyph right in front of Yang that draws her into it, and teleports her outside of the kingdom. Weiss has decided to expel them all. Blake, on the other hand, actually makes a successful attack against the nightmare, avoids Weiss's attacks, and is able to slash it, and we hear the nightmare scream in pain. It then uses its thorns to cover and almost protect the dress from Blake's interference. Blake goes to try to strike again, and Weiss creates a glyph that then teleports her away. So now it's just Ruby against Weiss and the nightmare, which really doesn't last that long. Ruby looked like she was about to try to use the relic to do something to try to drive the nightmare away, maybe, or see if it had some effect on it, but she didn't get the chance. As she picked it up, her hand hurt and she dropped it. and once she looked at her hand, she could see that the nightmare corruption had spread across her entire hand. And the relic was now lying on the floor. The Armagigas then attacks her. As she dodges out of the way, Weiss gets a hold of the relic. The nightmare thorns come out of Weiss's hand, strangle the relic, and shatter it. Another of the keys to Weiss's heart is now broken and unable to be used. The number of methods that they have to help them free Weiss from the nightmare are starting to really dwindle in this episode. Weiss then sends RWBY away using her glyphs, but we soon find out that RWBY was able to use her semblance to escape. Now, I kind of question this, given that Weiss would probably be able to see RWBY use her semblance, because she does create a flurry of rose petals, so unless the light from Weiss's glyph kind of blinded her to RWBY's movements in that moment, I think this is kind of a little bit of the plot needed RWBY to escape at this point in time. And we do see that RWBY was able to get out of the cathedral unnoticed. Weiss teleports away, and RWBY is about to go back in to attack the nightmare again, but she's stopped by someone else appearing behind her. Jean is now in the inner sanctum as well, and I really question how he got there, considering that he tells RWBY that she can't do it alone and asks her for a coin to be able to create a doorway back to the train. He had used up all of his already, so it really implies that Jean walked all the way to the inner sanctum from the train. You know, the train where the nightmare was surrounding it, pretty much. We know that Jean created the door that was initially inside the train that RWBY connected to, but he didn't have a coin to help him and RWBY get back. So, considering that the doorways only connect from one to another, it's not like they're all interconnected with each other, Jean had to create the one doorway in the train, walk all the way to the inner sanctum while avoiding the nightmare's thorns, and then get RWBY to create the door that would connect to the one in the train. I highly doubt Jean was able to make it all the way there. And that's not me putting Jean down because of his fighting capabilities being less than any other of the members of Team RWBY. I don't think any one of the members who were there, whether it be RWBY, Yang, or Blake, could make it there given this situation on their own. I really question how Jean was able to get there. Regardless, he and RWBY head back to the train where Pyrrha and 10 of the tiny Weisses are waiting. There's only 10 of the tiny Weisses left. Last episode, there was 50. So 40 of them have fallen, and they better be safe by the end of Ice Queendom, which realistically they are, given that in Volume 2, Weiss doesn't have all of her childhood memories destroyed, at least not that we know of. So, you know, we'll see what ends up happening. They're probably safe somewhere. They better be safe somewhere, but we'll wait and see. Next, we see what happened to Blake and Yang. They were transported well outside of the kingdom, but not to the place that I thought they were going to be. In my review of the last episode, I noticed that the kind of weird signs that were all twisted and contorted were each at the location of a relic. There was one lying in the bed of RWBY, in the bunk beds, which, by the way, we also saw was now corrupted by the nightmares, and Sleepy Klein was also frozen shut. So, in other words, another Klein bites the dust, and this safe haven is no longer safe. And then there was the tree that had all of these signs that was housing the yellow relic, so I thought that the black relic, or purple relic, whichever one was going to represent Blake, was going to be hidden underneath the sign that we always saw when we first entered the dream. And I kind of hope that's still the case, because that sign should hold some significance, given everything we've seen thus far, but Blake and Yang were transported to a mansion that has a few indicative signs out front. One of a wolf's head woven out of metal, one of kind of a face with cat ears, and also like "do not enter." It is a very creepy looking mansion, as there are also a couple of mannequins almost that look like they're being hung in the trees. One right side up, one upside down, and the faces that are used for them are a little bit creepy because they definitely don't match with the animation style of Ice Queendom. We can all kind of imagine what this place is supposed to be, but we'll find out that in a moment. For now, we see the conversation between RWBY and Jean, where Jean is explaining to her that by removing the relic from the Silly's jail, that made all of Weiss's childhood memories, the tiny Weisses, vulnerable to the nightmare. Just as Ren and Pyrrha had said before they entered the dream, the things that were contained in the Silly's jail were things that Weiss was trying to protect from the nightmare, not imprison them. And Ruby's curious about that. Well, then why lock them up? And John explains, well, you have to kind of hold your childhood memories inside. You can't let them control you. That's how you become an adult. You have other responsibilities, and so you need to have control over your inner emotions, which I do understand the kind of metaphor and lesson that they're trying to go for here. However, her inner mind is trying to protect her memories from the nightmare, so keeping them contained in one area where she knows where they are at all times and trying to keep them away from the nightmare that can't get in there makes sense. Though, I guess what they're referring to is more the fact that it is looking like a jail cell, that there's the bars and the guard and everything, so I understand what they're going for. However, I don't think it quite translates that well. Let me know what your thoughts are down in the comments below on what you think of everything that's happened thus far. Ruby then starts to question herself even more. If she's been doing the right thing. She's been trying to help Weiss, but that's only been out of selfishness. She's just been hurting her in the process. And then she starts to get even more negative, saying that she never worried about Weiss. She never thought anything like this would ever happen. She also expresses that she's kind of jealous of Team Juniper, how they always care for each other, they look out for one another, and Pyrrha was the one who noticed when this happened to Jean, but Ruby didn't notice anything. And she begins to start crying. Pyrrha and the tiny Weisses all go over to try to comfort her, but it's already too little too late. We see Ruby's hand as the nightmare's corruption had already grown even around the backside of it, and she starts to repeat the sentiment that Weiss had said to her before, that she's an embarrassment, and that she has no right to be a leader at all, as she falls to her side and falls unconscious, falling under the influence of the nightmare affecting her. Now, I disagree with a few things that Ruby has said here, but I understand why they were said. This is the nightmare bringing Ruby's insecurities to the surface. But thinking about it logically, no one on either Team Juniper nor Team RWBY expected anything like this to happen. They didn't even know about the nightmares at the beginning of this series. Xion didn't inform anyone of this happening, and when Ruby said that Pyrrha noticed Jean, that was only once they woke up in the morning and Jean would not wake up. He was still asleep, and then they asked Xion, and that's how they found out about the nightmares. It was probably a similar thing that happened with Weiss, though we didn't get to see it on screen. Someone found her lying unconscious on the floor, most likely, and then they were able to start helping her by jumping into the dream. And Ruby's actions, really, she was left with no other choice. Up until this point, Ruby had no idea that the relics were acting as an area of protection for other things for Weiss, and Xion had specifically told them all to find the relics, as those were the keys to Weiss's heart. So they were under the impression that they needed to go find the relics to help them save Weiss. Ruby really did nothing wrong here, but I absolutely understand why these are insecurities that she holds, and why they're being brought to the surface by the nightmare. And then we cut to this. You know how I had mentioned that the mannequins and stuff that were hanging on that creepy mansion really looked creepy? Yeah, they really do, especially once we get a close-up image of them. Blake and Yang then approach the mansion, and the door to the mansion is the final Klein, Bashful Klein, and Bashful Klein is in charge of imprisoning all of the people that are not allowed in the kingdom, aka all of the Faunus, which is where Blake belongs in the dream. And because this is where Blake belongs in the dream, that's why I'm kind of thinking that this is probably where her relic is going to be, though the relic that was supposed to represent Yang wasn't actually where Yang was supposed to be in the dream, considering Yang was locked up with Ruby, but the yellow relic was in the Silly's jail, so I still hope that the sign that they've seen every time that they enter the dream is still where Blake's relic is going to be hidden, as it's representative of Weiss's confusion in the outside world, but we'll have to wait and see, as we see kind of a looming image of the mansion, but then we cut away to see what Weiss is doing inside her inner sanctum. Before I get to that, though, I do want to point out, in this mansion, this is where all of the Faunus are locked up. which means this is where we might actually see a dream version of Sun. Because Weiss does have opinions on him, that he's a rapscallion, and she's still unsure about him, so he's probably locked up in here, and we might see a dream version of Sun next episode. Or possibly the episode after that, depending on what direction they go in episode 9, but I'll touch on that in a bit. In Weiss's inner sanctum, things are playing out in a similar fashion. She goes in, sits down, has her coat taken off, has the book going on the mantelpiece, and is asking Klein for a report. And Doc, the one that's represented by the fire, is still there, gives the report that everything has returned to normal, everyone is calm. But one thing that is very different, well, a couple things, really. First of all, the giant hologram of Jacques is still covered in the armor and is seeming to lose their sanity or individuality as they're stuttering over their words and are not as clear-spoken as before, just saying massive responsibility, huge responsibility, instead of being as clear-cut as Jacques was in the past. Oh, and also, Sneezy Klein, the little dog Klein, is nowhere to be found. Instead, it is replaced by the Armagigas that is holding Weiss's weapon. So far, at least, we have 4 Kleins down. Sneezy Klein, probably gone. The poor doggo, something happened to it in the massive battle. We saw that Grumpy Klein got taken out by Weiss herself, and then Dopey Klein and Sleepy Klein were corrupted by the Nightmare and frozen, so Klein's not faring so well anymore. We've met Bashful Klein now, and considering a Klein is outside of the kingdom, that's also a little bit surprising. Klein is supposed to be Weiss's personal butler, someone that she always wants to keep close to her, as he's very helpful. And you'd think that all of them would be located in the kingdom, but this one is way outside the kingdom, so, maybe there's something to be said about that. Maybe Weiss isn't that fond of that personality of Klein's, not that fond of Bashful Klein, and that's why he's all the way out there as well. Maybe this is a little bit of an insight on how Weiss feels about Klein, or at least some of his personalities. But now, as Doc is giving the report to Weiss, he says, since things have returned to calm, all true daughters of Schnee can now attain true sleep. You know, that thing he referenced to the coffin before? The coffin that held the white relic, representative of another key to Weiss's heart? Well, now the coffin appears right in front of Weiss, and as she's standing in front of it, she mutters, "True sleep." But the vines of the Nightmare then wrap around the relic and shatter it as well. So now that's another of the keys to Weiss's heart completely gone. The only one left being the one that represents Blake, and quite possibly Jean's sword that he brought with him into the dream. But if Jean is the final key to Weiss's heart, I'm going to question that just a little bit, because Jean really doesn't seem that important to Weiss. Pyrrha, yes, I would understand that. Jean, not really so much. Either way, though, the white relic is now shattered, and after it is, Ruby wakes up. The string that was covering her eyes had torn, and she wakes up in the room. She looks around and there's no one near her, but the doors quickly open and the rest of her team passes through, including Weiss. And she tells Ruby, her best friend and magnificent leader, that it was all thanks to her that Weiss was able to wake up. And then they all start clapping. And then Team Juniper and the professors come in, and they all start clapping. And Ruby's just sitting there, blushing and being like, oh, shucks, it was nothing, really. And then she notices her father and Zwei there. And then the tiny Weisses run in. And then the military from Weiss's dream runs in. And then she realizes that, oh no, this isn't reality. All of them are standing in a circle around her clapping, very reminiscent of the very strange ending of Neon Genesis Evangelion, if you've ever seen it. Personally, I don't recommend the series, but I know there's a lot of people out there that rave about it. It's personally not for me. I didn't enjoy it, even though I do own the collector's edition of it, but that was part of a group purchase. Anyways, then all of the people around Ruby turn into the dolls as she's realized that she isn't actually awake. And we see the nightmare thorns start to creep up from each of them. And this is where the episode ends. a dream within a dream is probably going to be the next episode. Something that I've been kind of hoping for a while now. In most of my reviews, I have mentioned that hopefully at some point we will see at least a glimpse of Ruby's nightmare. Get to delve a little bit into her mentality and her insecurities at this point in the series, which have been on full display throughout this series. It was obvious that they were hinting towards this as the series progressed, especially once Ruby got cut by the Nightmare's thorns. It was pretty obvious she was going to get infected by the Nightmare, and we were going to see her inner dream world as well. But what's different about her inner dream is that she's conscious. She's lucid within this dream. She can understand that it is a dream, and ideally, she'll be able to fight back against it. Because if she can't, well, then they're just screwed. Because Ruby is now asleep within the dream, and her counterpart within Weiss's dream is just useless, and she's going to have to fight within her own mind. And considering Shion is already using their semblance and a lot of their aura to help 4 people jump into Weiss's dream, I don't know if Shion has the capability to allow other people to then jump within someone else's dream while they're already inside another dream. Yeah, you ever hear of the movie Inception? This is where we're going with this series, and I'm kind of all for it. I'm really curious to see where this is going to go. But Ruby is probably going to have to be able to break herself out of the dream, or perhaps Jean will be able to jump into the dream and help Ruby in some way, shape, or form. Maybe the sword is going to help facilitate this in some way, given that Jean is immune to the nightmare. Some things are going to have to play out. We're going to get to explore Ruby's insecurities, and she's going to have to wake up at some point in time, obviously. All of these characters survive to the next volume, so we know they're going to get out of it at the end, but this is also an alternate story, so maybe things will turn out differently and leave things open for a potential sequel. We'll have to wait and see. Regardless, I really like the direction that this is headed. Hopefully we'll get some explanation to Jean's blade that he brought with him into the dream, as I still don't understand where it came from. There were a number of suggestions in the comments of my last review saying that this could be from how Weiss sees Jean, or due to Jean's immunity to the nightmare, this could be due to how Jean views himself, that he sees himself as this caped hero with this elegant sword ready to rescue the damsel in distress, or the fair maiden, the Ice Queen as he keeps calling her. And I could understand that if it wasn't a separate weapon. Jean still enters the dream with his Crocea Moors. He still has the regular sword and shield that he's used to wielding. If he saw himself as a hero, I would think that the Crocea Moors that he has, the weapon that he would actually cherish because it's a family heirloom, his grandfather used it during the Great War and it had been passed down to him along with this family legacy, I would think that his actual weapon would take on the more elegant appearance, not just be given an extra sword. The only thing that it could be at this point in time is something to represent Jean's immunity to the nightmare, something that Jean himself mentioned earlier in this episode, which I understand the principle of it. However, I also don't really get it. That, okay, you've been infected by the nightmare before, so now you have a greater chance to fight against the nightmare by jumping into people's dreams. You're just given a key to their heart, essentially, or a safe haven against the nightmare. Like, I don't know. It doesn't quite add up. Might just be something for the plot of Ice Queendom, which, if so, you know, that's the way a lot of shows go. There is some explanation to it, and I might make a video on it in the future, but we'll see. In the meantime, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. How did you guys enjoy this episode? Things are certainly building towards a final conclusion in Ice Queendom, with Ruby now in her own nightmare within Weiss's nightmare, and having Weiss expelled everyone from her kingdom. So that now Blake and Yang will see how she truly feels about the Faunus. But we'll wait and see what happens in the next episode. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, more RWBY content in general, make sure to subscribe and join the Guild of the Eternal Flame. Tweet me at PhoenixKnight7, and I'll see you guys in the next video.